Welcome to BICOM's Hadiyun podcast. My name is James Sorene, BICOM CEO. I'm joined by Calev Ben-Dor and Richard Pater in Israel. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. Just a quick note for all our listeners. If you listen to our podcast, you like our podcast, then please review it on iTunes. Please leave comments. And if you have any feedback, then please let us know. We'd like to hear what you are thinking about what we are saying every week. This week has been another busy week in the Israeli election campaign. We are now just really 4 and a bit weeks away from polling day on the 9th of April. And I wanted to really discuss with you, Richard and Calev, some of the rhetoric and some of the mudslinging that's been taking place in the campaign between the various politicians. And I want to really start off with a moment of some controversy, which was actually not one between politicians, but was actually led to headlines of, Wonder Woman taking down Prime Minister Netanyahu, or at least a sort of spat between Prime Minister Netanyahu and her TV presenter Rotem Seller, and then Gal Gadot, who played Wonder Woman in the motion picture, coming to her defense. This was all about the nation-state bill, and this was about some comments that Rotem Seller put on Instagram about how she was unhappy with what Miri Regev was saying about Benny Gantz looking to form a government with Arab parties, and was implying that that was a very bad thing. And she was then making statements about Arab citizens in Israel being equal and, all Israelis being equal. And then that led to a response from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, among quite a long quote on Instagram, said, Israel is not the state of all its citizens. And he went on to talk about the nation-state law. But it was that one sentence or phrase that was picked up by many people in Israel and also the international media, and it got a lot of media coverage in the UK, where Prime Minister Netanyahu seemed to be saying, Israel is not a state for its Arab citizens. And I wanted to get your comments on that. So who wants to start? Richard?
Yeah, I'll kick off. First of all, what you're saying, the narrative as you lay it out is pretty accurate. I think one explanation of what Netanyahu was trying to say, and I don't want to be making excuses for him, but I'll nevertheless kind of put up a devil's advocate as a defense for him, is that he was answering a particular point when Rotem Seller was saying Israel is a state of all its citizens. Now, so there are two ways in which you can interpret such a term. On the face level, it can be perceived, and this is how it was perceived on a basic level, that it's outrageous to suggest Israel is anything but anything, and it is of course a state of all its citizens, because every citizen has a right, and that includes all the Israeli Arabs and the minorities have full voting rights and are full equal citizens. What Netanyahu, I think, was trying to say about, whilst also sending the signal to his home team about, is that the quote in Hebrew of a state of all its citizens is a political jargon, which means instead of a Jewish state, losing the symbolism of the Jewish state and becoming basically a binational state. And what we know about Netanyahu from other instances, it reminded me of around when he first came in 2009, so over a decade ago, and he was refusing to recognize a Palestinian state, obviously up until the Bar Ilan speech. And that was his argument. Netanyahu was a man of words and a man of documents and a legalistic outlook on life. And he was objecting at the time to a Palestinian state because, as he decided, I think he even referred to Max Weber's definition of statehood, is that the Palestinians would never be able to have an army, would never be able to have a control of things. And so therefore, he was rejecting it on principle. And so similar to this case, he was making a point of principle that he was rejecting the idea of the concept of the state of all its citizens, because that was losing or kind of nullifying the Jewish identity. And that's what he wanted to then go on to explain. But obviously people saw that as kind of being quite difficult and problematic to swallow.
Well, he was implying that, in some way Arabs were not equal before the law and didn't have equal rights. I mean, I think it wasn't also, as we know, it wasn't just about what he said, but it was also coming off the back of an election campaign where his rhetoric has been very much about the fact that Gantz and Lapid are leftists who will basically form a coalition with only with the support of the Arab parties, and that support of the Arab parties had some questionable legitimacy. And his chant that he's getting people to chant at campaign events where he says, it's Bibi or Tibi. It's either Bibi Netanyahu or it's a coalition that will only be able to block him with the help of Ahmad Tibi of the Arab parties. I mean, Calev, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I kind of actually want to take the conversation in a slightly different place. Firstly, if I can just do a bit of a shout out on Tuesday, basically every Tuesday, Fathom has been publishing a number of articles about the Israeli elections. I'd very much encourage anyone who's interested to go on fathomjournal.org. But this coming Tuesday, we have an article about the potential of Arab parties to enter the coalition or to support it from outside as a blocking majority. So I think that, the initial, as you said, the initial conversation was actually about to what extent can majorities or kind of 61 seat governments be formed. And I think that's kind of interesting, and it's interesting to look at in and of itself. The second thing I'd say is that good 6 to 9 months ago, we knew elections were going to be happening sometime during 2019. We didn't know exactly when. And what analysts were saying was that the nation state law would in some ways take center stage of the elections. And Netanyahu would argue that his government passed the nation state law. It ensures or it guarantees a kind of a Jewish and democratic state. And anyone who was against it, which was actually quite a large number of Zionist parties, but anyone who was against it was a leftist who didn't care about a Jewish state. Now, the nation-state law has not been a central topic in the elections at all. It's primarily been a referendum on Netanyahu. It's primarily been focused around the corruption investigations. But it's interesting that certainly for a few days, Netanyahu brought that back in to the conversation. He clearly feels that he is on safer and stronger ground when that is the topic of conversation rather than other things.
I think, it's interesting also to recall exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. So when he put on the Instagram post, he said, Israel is not the state of all its citizens. According to basic law that we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, and it's alone. As you wrote, talking about Rotem Seller, there is no problem with the Arab citizens of Israel. They have equal rights as all of us, and the Likud government has invested more in the Arab sector than any other government, which in some ways may be okay were it not for the tone of a lot of the other statements in the campaign and this constant narrative that if Benny Gantz manages to form a coalition or a blocking majority, he'll be reliant on the Arab parties, and implying that is in some way illegitimate. But I think the next point of this as well, I thought was very interesting, and we should just reflect on, is that President Reuven Rivlin, who is a largely ceremonial post, but he does get involved in the Israeli political debate when there are issues around the cohesion of society, or he feels he needs to intervene in order to, be a unifying force. And I thought it was really interesting that he said at a conference the next day at the Truman Institute, the Hebrew University of all places, where he said, "We've been seeing unacceptable discourse about Israel's Arab citizens. I refuse to believe that there are parties that will concede Israel's image as a Jewish and democratic state, democratic and Jewish, with a single remark." And then he goes on to say that there are absolute equal rights in the state of Israel for all citizens. So that was something of a rebuke. But I wanted to just ask you both also the question, how much of this really matters? I mean, you've got this solid Likud support in the election, really not gone below 28 seats in the predicted polls. I mean, does any of this have any impact on that Likud support and maybe make people think again about whether they'll vote for Prime Minister Netanyahu? What's your view?
My assessment is that this is carefully thought out. That this does not play badly within his constituency. I mean, again, anecdotally, I can tell you that the people here I'm speaking to, that's a kind of a range of voters, that the people who are voting for Likud have known it from the beginning and are very are very satisfied and comfortable that there's no, whilst everyone else who is in the non-Likud camp is kind of still agonising over kind of sticking where they went last time or going with this new phenomena. I mean, bottom line, I think Netanyahu has made a very crude calculation that those on the right of the political map, this is not harming it whatsoever. And again, and really the effort is. I mean, we spoke about this earlier. The kind of the level of concern that Netanyahu has to face the Generals Party, the Blue and White Party, is a sense that he's going for this for this what they refer to here as the Gewalt campaign, kind of going for these shrill comments much earlier than he did in the cycle last time round, in order to shore up the right wing base. And having made the deal, or having kind of orchestrated the deal to make sure that the right wing parties are more or less united, so that they will still scrape through and, God forbid, not have wasted votes. He's now making sure that the Likud is by far and away the largest party in that camp, and will obviously have the opportunity to form the next government.
Right. So let's just move on to what we think is happening with the Blue and White Party. And we've had a debate about this within the team during this week, looking at the polls. I wrote one of my regular articles about the Israeli election, where I called it, has the blue and white bubble burst? Because from my perspective, there was this big bubble that inflated after the Attorney General made his announcement about indicting the Prime Minister. Blue and White Party predicted to win 37 seats. That looked a very big increase on previous projections. And the polls starting to show that actually the predictions are around 30-31. So my question was, has the bubble burst? And are we going to see the Blue and White Party going back to the higher 30s? Or is that it now? And we're going to see a fight all the way through to the end, where the Blue and White Party will only be able to get about 30-32 seats, and Likud will be on 28-29. So my view was potentially the bubble has burst. That sort of frisson of excitement just after the Attorney General's announcement, the formation of the new party, has gone, and it's going to be hard for them to break through that again. We'll see what the polls say next week, but that's sort of, I suppose, my contention. And it may be that the polls are reasonably fixed, but I know, Calev, you had a different view about what the polls were saying this week.
Yes, so firstly, polls are a reflection of where the public are at the moment, rather than any kind of predictive direction. So I'm not sure if we can guess where things are going to go from now. I think a couple of things. There were three, in my opinion, very significant events that happened within a short time of one another. There was the merger between Jewish Home and Jewish Power, which was basically midwifed by Netanyahu, and which many people were found very controversial and were very distressed by. More or less on the same day, there was a second merger, which was Yesh Atid and Benny Gantz's party. And I think there were a lot of people who were either unsure of who they were going to vote for, but then suddenly, once there was this merged party, they thought that this was really a serious competition for Likud, and they decided that they were going to vote for it, and it got a big boost. Several days later, there was the AG's, the Attorney General's announcement over the corruption charges. And I think those three things together gave Blue and White a big push. And there was always probably inevitably going to be some sort of downgrading after that. However, if we look at the numbers of the blocks, so we count up the amount that Likud plus Yisrael Beitenu plus New Right plus United Right plus the ultra-Orthodox parties plus potentially Kulanu get, it's actually been pretty similar for a while now. It's around the 60, 61, maybe sometimes 62, as in even when Blue and White were leading, Likud had a slightly better chance of forming a coalition. But all of these numbers, I'd say, are within the margin of error, which basically means that it's more or less a dead heat. I just say one other thing, which also affects numbers. Whether smaller parties get over or under the threshold also affects the numbers. So the first week when we were seeing higher numbers for Blue and White was when several smaller parties were under the threshold, and therefore Blue and White got more. the past few days, smaller parties have been over the threshold, and that has brought down the numbers of blue and white. So I'm not convinced anything significantly has changed. I'm not convinced we can predict going forward, but I think we can definitely say that it is a very, very close race.
And the thing that's really interesting that I've been looking at is this: what is the support of the Blue and White Party? And even if they've got, whether it's 30 or 35 seats they're predicted to get, when you look at each party's base, the Likud base is strong. And this is something I've discussed with pollsters, that they predicted all the way through, right from the beginning, not to get any less than 27, 28 seats and nowhere more than about 32. And that's been solid all the way through. So you could conclude at the moment that it's likely that they might win that amount of seats. Blue and White Party has been very volatile. It was only created, a couple of weeks ago. Its base is Yesh Atid, which is a strong base of support. They've been around for a while. And in all the polls, they're predicted to get somewhere between 10 and 12 seats. But the rest of that support, the other 20 seats that they could potentially be predicted to get, they're nomadic. They are floating voters that have come from other parties. They're very fickle. We're not quite sure whether they're going to stick with that party. Are they going to go back to the parties they came from? So, it's a really flaky base. And I think that's also going to affect, what the polls say over the next few weeks. But I wanted to just move on to a thing that I was quite taken by just yesterday, was some of the rhetoric. And there was a real sort of war of the rhetoric, which got to a slightly ridiculous level, where we had a situation, was it yesterday, where Naftali Bennett was saying that Benny Gantz was Hamas's wet dream, and that he was trying to undermine Benny Gantz's security credentials by saying that when Naftali Bennett was in the security cabinet during the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, Benny Gantz was indecisive. He was not determined to push to victory, which is something that Naftali Bennett is obsessed with, this idea that the IDF has not pushed to victory. What did you both make of this? I mean, it's a slightly sort of ridiculous level of rhetoric, but it's Naftali Bennett pushing to try and, really undermine Benny Gantz as this kind of warrior leader with security credentials.
I think there's an element of this which needs unpacking from the outside, because perhaps for good or for bad, Israelis are very used to a very robust, combative style of politics, and it's natural for the leading parties really to go after each other. It's interesting that there was this pact, so to speak, made between Bibi and the other right-wing parties that they wouldn't attack each other. That's held to a large degree. So Benny Gantz is the perfect target for Bennett to go for, and to kind of to pick up on these old wounds, as you said, about the lack of determination of the IDF to win, kind of in Bennett's rhetoric. Early this week, it's been, just reflecting on what Calev was saying just before, I think we're kind of in a part of a phony campaign, that for a couple of days, all of the candidates were dragged along to a very marginal issue of legalizing marijuana, which is kind of the pet project of the Zehut party, which suddenly appears in the polls, and therefore suddenly all the mainstream parties were talking about this, and they'd be talked up about the importance of medical marijuana, and exporting it, and said that he would form a committee to look into the issue of legalization. Meretz got very upset because they've long been supporting the legalization issue and thought that Zehut was kind of stealing their thunder. But really, in the scheme of things, this is a really marginal issue that no one really is going to go to not no one, but a very, very tiny percentage of the population is going to go to vote on this issue. And so we've been dragged away. And so ironically, despite the kind of the coarse rhetoric of Gaza is one of those real policy issues that will come back, and actually will have a substantial issue within this election. We know that we're approaching the year anniversary of the March of Return, and the IDF is on a heavy, steady state of alert, ready for ongoing violence, particularly in Gaza, but also spilling over into other Palestinian areas. And these are the issues that, whether there is that return of violence, that at some point the candidates will have to have a substantial comment and a say on these issues. One last thought is that with Benny Gantz now announcing that he's going to be going to the AIPAC conference and speaking there the day before Netanyahu, this is a really important moment for him to You give him the stage of a genuine statesman and a leader. And although kind of Netanyahu here is known for his polished English and polished performances, I think Israelis will be looking and giving Gantz a rehearsal run when they see him at AIPAC to see what he's like in English and how he can present himself there. So that will be a really important moment.
But that's fascinating because this is Bibi's stage. He's been there for years. He's polished American English. The crowd will love him. He's very, very used to this, and it's likely he'll get kind of rapturous applause. But for Benny Gantz, this is a real risk. He's not as comfortable a speaker in English. He's good, but he's not amazing. It's really interesting to see what the crowd do with that. They'll respect him as a former IDF chief of staff, but also the other issue is he doesn't really have much room for maneuver. I think to really look different to Bibi. He can't really attack Bibi there. What he says around security will be similar to what Bibi says on many issues. So it's going to be quite hard for him to really, really shine. So I imagine there's a lot of people really scratching their heads about what exactly they're going to do there. So fascinating stuff. Gentlemen, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for the discussion today. And to our listeners, please keep listening. Please review us on iTunes and do feedback and let us know. But Richard, Calev, thank you very much.